An alien queen chose one human over her entire council. Here's why it shattered everything. The Valkyrie did not issue invitations. That was the first thing Ambassador Sarah Mullen's briefing team told her when the encoded transmission arrived at humanity's diplomatic relay station 14, orbiting quietly at the edge of the Oort cloud. The message was not addressed to Earth's government. It was not addressed to the United Human Compact, nor to the Joint Military-Civilian Diplomatic Corps. It was addressed to her. By name. In a language the Valkyrie had never, in 42 years of cold first contact, chosen to speak to any human. Galactic Standard. Sarah set the data tablet down on the briefing table and looked at the three people across from her. Admiral Doran Yush, head of Compact Defense Intelligence. Director Priya Halson, Civilian Diplomatic Chair. And Dr. Marcus Wen, the xenolinguist who had spent 20 years translating the marginal fragments of Valkyrie communications that were never meant to be translated. None of them spoke for a long moment. "She knows your name," Dr. Wen said finally. His voice was careful, measured. The voice of a man who had spent 2 decades understanding that words in alien contexts carried mass, not just meaning. "She knows everyone's name," Sarah replied. "She runs a hegemony of 43 systems." "She used your name," one said. "Not your title. Not your rank. Your personal name. In Galactic Standard. That's not a courtesy. That's a signal." Admiral Yush leaned forward. He was a compact man, former destroyer captain, with the particular stillness of someone who had survived 3 fleet engagements by refusing to panic. The signal being? That she's been watching. Specifically. That this isn't diplomatic protocol, it's personal vetting. One slid the data tablet back toward the center of the table. The Valkyrie Queen doesn't receive diplomats. She receives people she has already decided are worth her time. The invitation isn't the beginning of the process. It's the end of one we didn't know we were in. Sarah read the message again. It was 11 sentences long. In diplomatic terms, it was almost insultingly brief. The Queen of the Valkyrie hegemony, Sovereign Matriarch Zelera IV, ruler of the oldest continuous interstellar civilization in the known cluster, was requesting the presence of one human representative aboard her flagship. Not a delegation. Not a team. One person. And she had named Sarah Mullen, Deputy Ambassador, 3rd Chair of Compact Diplomatic Services, a woman who had spent most of her career mediating trade disputes between mining consortiums in the Outer Belt. "Why me?" Sarah said. It wasn't quite a question. Director Halson spoke for the first time. She was a tall woman with the careful posture of someone perpetually aware that her words would be recorded and analyzed later. "We don't know." Which is, itself, significant. Our intelligence on Valkyrie decision-making processes is, to be frank, almost entirely theoretical. What we know is behavioral. What we don't know is how they assign value to individuals. Then we're operating blind. "We're always operating blind with the Valkyrie," Halson said. "The difference is that before today they weren't looking at us." The Valkyrie had been humanity's closest alien neighbor for over 4 decades, and in that time they had communicated with Earth precisely 9 times. All 9 communications had been unilateral. Boundary notifications. Resource claim filings. One formal acknowledgement of humanity's existence as a recognized developing species, which had sparked a week of furious debate in the Compact Parliament about whether developing was an insult or a legal classification. It was, Dr. Wen's team eventually concluded, simply accurate. The Valkyrie were not hostile. They were something harder to navigate than hostile. They were indifferent. Their hegemony had existed for roughly 3,000 years. They had encountered 14 other spacefaring civilizations in that span. Of those 14, 3 had been absorbed into the hegemony as client states. 4 had been quarantined, not attacked, simply contained, placed behind boundary markers that no Valkyrie ship would cross and no quarantine species ship could cross without triggering automated defense responses that humanity's best analysts estimated could neutralize a medium-sized fleet in under 6 minutes. The remaining 7 civilizations had, over time, simply ceased to develop. They had plateaued, stalled, turned inward. Whether this was natural entropy or the result of some subtle Valkyrie influence, no one in the Compact could say for certain. Humanity was, by the Valkyrie's own classification, still in the observation window, still being watched, still being weighed. And now, one of humanity's mid-tier diplomats had been called to the throne room of the most powerful sovereign in the known cluster, and no one, not Compact Intelligence, not the Diplomatic Corps, not the Alien Studies Division at the University of New Nairobi, could explain why. Sarah accepted the invitation within 6 hours. Not because she had weighed every strategic angle and concluded acceptance was optimal, though she had, in fact, spent those 6 hours doing precisely that. She accepted because the alternative was to decline, and declining an invitation that had never before been extended to any human being was a different kind of answer. A permanent one. She drafted her acceptance in Galactic Standard, kept it to 4 sentences, used the Valkyrie convention of placing the name of the recipient first and the name of the sender last, and did not include her rank or title. Dr. Wen had advised her on this. Don't perform your credentials for her. She already knows them. What she doesn't know is whether you understand that she knows them. She hit send. The message propagated through the relay network. Somewhere, in a fleet that humanity's long-range sensors had tracked to within 2 light-years but never directly observed, the Queen of the Valkyrie received confirmation that a human was coming. Admiral Yush walked her to the docking bay the next morning. He didn't say much. At the door, he stopped and looked at her with the expression of a man who had run the numbers and knew the margins were thin. You understand, he said, that you're not just representing Earth. You're representing every decision we've made in 40 years of contact. Every message we sent. Every boundary we respected. Every one we tested. He paused. And every one we didn't. Sarah picked up her case. I know. The Council wants a full debrief within 72 hours of your return. He left the word if unspoken, but they both heard it. Tell the Council, Sarah said, to be patient. The Valkyrie will notice if we're anxious. She walked through the docking bay door. The shuttle was already running. Behind her, Admiral Yush stood very still and watched the door close, and thought about all the things humanity had spent 40 years hoping an alien civilization would someday notice in them. He hoped they'd gotten it right. The Valkyrie flagship had no name humanity could pronounce. Dr. Wen's team had attempted it twice, using acoustic mapping of the 3 communication intercepts in which the ship had been referenced by Valkyrie military channels. Both attempts had produced sounds that, when played back, caused a mild disorientation in human listeners, a spatial confusion, a momentary sense of depth without dimension. One had eventually labeled the ship in compact records as silent geometry, which was his interpretation, not a translation. He had been honest about that in his notes. Sarah saw it for the first time through the shuttle's forward viewport approximately 4 hours into her transit, and her first impression was not of size, though the ship was enormous. Her first impression was of intention. Every line of the vessel looked deliberate. There was no visible weapon emplacement, no obvious engine configuration, none of the functional asymmetry that human warships wore openly as a statement of purpose. The flagship looked like something that had been thought about for a very long time before anyone had been permitted to build it. It was roughly 3 kilometers end to end. Dark composite hull, non-reflective, absorbing light in a way that made it look slightly unreal against the star field, like a shape cut from the universe rather than placed in it. Sarah's shuttle was escorted by 2 smaller Valkyrie craft that had appeared alongside without any communication, matching her speed and course with an ease that suggested the maneuver was automatic, not piloted. She did not find this comforting. She did not find it threatening either. She filed it the way she had learned to file things during 15 years of diplomatic work. Observed, noted, meaning undetermined. The docking bay was the first interior she saw, and it established a pattern she would spend the next 48 hours learning to read. The Valkyrie did not design spaces for human scale, but they had not designed them against it either. The bay was large enough for ships twice the size of her shuttle, with ceiling height that suggested the Valkyrie were either taller than Earth's biometric estimates had predicted, or simply preferred volume as a default design principle. 3 figures waited on the deck. They were Valkyrie, her first real look at the species at close range, not through filtered sensor data or the 3 existing image intercepts that Compact Intelligence had spent years analyzing. They were taller than humans, averaging close to 2 meters, with the elongated proportions that adapted well to moderate gravity environments. Their skin had a faint iridescence that the sensor images had never quite captured, not bioluminescence, more like the structural coloration of certain earth beetles, light refracting slightly differently depending on angle. Their eyes were large, dark, forward-facing. Predator configuration, the xenobiologists had always noted, though one had pushed back on the implication. Predator configuration also correlates with depth perception, he'd written in one paper, which correlates with tool use, which correlates with civilization. None of the 3 spoke when Sarah exited the shuttle. The tallest, she noted the slight elevation in collar structure that appeared to indicate rank in the 3 existing images, extended one hand, palm facing inward. Sarah had memorized enough Valkyrie gestural convention to recognize a contextual marker. You are seen. Not a greeting exactly. An acknowledgement of presence. She placed her own hand parallel to theirs, palm inward. The figure held stillness for a moment, then turned and walked toward the interior corridor. She followed. What she observed in the next 2 hours of transit through the ship she would later describe in her report not as a tour, since no one explained anything, but as a curated exposure. She was walked through specific corridors, past specific spaces. She was not shown everything. She was shown what someone had decided she should see, in an order that someone had decided mattered. The crew, and there were hundreds of Valkyrie moving through the ship's passages, did not ignore her. They observed her with a quality of attention that was different from human curiosity. Human curiosity tends to be animated, expressive, slightly undisciplined. The Valkyrie who looked at her did so with a stillness that felt analytical. Not cold exactly. More like the focused attention of someone solving a problem they find genuinely interesting. She cataloged what she could. The ship used a lighting system that shifted spectrum gradually as she moved through different sections. Warmer in what appeared to be common areas, cooler in what appeared to be operational spaces. The transition was subtle enough that she didn't consciously register it for the first 20 minutes, which suggested it was designed to be felt rather than noticed. Environmental psychology alien style. The walls in the corridor approaching what she identified as the command section displayed something she had no reference for. A continuous low-relief pattern that ran the full length of the passage, geometric but not repetitive, complex enough that she couldn't resolve its organizing logic in the time available. She made a mental note and kept walking. At the end of a long approach corridor, wider than the others, with ceiling height that increased incrementally over roughly 60 meters, her escort stopped. They stepped to the side. The corridor opened into a large chamber ahead. No one gestured for her to enter. No one spoke. No protocol was performed. Sarah stood at the threshold for 3 full seconds, understanding that what happened next was already known and that her hesitation was itself being observed. Then she walked forward. The Queen of the Valkyrie was seated, which Sarah had not expected. Every compact intelligence assessment had depicted Zelera 4 as a figure associated with elevated platforms, raised throne configurations, the architecture of authority that most hierarchical civilizations employ in formal settings. The Queen was sitting at a table. Low, wide, covered in what appeared to be physical documents, actual paper or something like it, covered in script. She was writing when Sarah entered, and she did not stop writing immediately. She finished a line. Set down the instrument. Looked up. Her eyes were the same dark configuration as the others, but her iridescence was different. A blue shift that wasn't common in the crew Sarah had passed. Age marker possibly. Or rank. Or both. She was neither old nor young in any way Sarah could meaningfully assess. She was simply present in the room with a quality of density that high authority figures in every culture Sarah had ever worked in shared. The sense of someone accustomed to being the fixed point around which everything else orbits. She said 2 words in galactic standard. Sit down. Sarah sat. The Queen looked at her for a long time in the Valkyrie way, still, focused, processing. Then she said, "You did not bring a recording device." It wasn't a question. Sarah had left every recording instrument on the shuttle, on the advice of Dr. Wen, who had spent 20 years thinking about what the Valkyrie considered a declaration of intent. She had brought a notepad and a pen. Physical. Analog. A choice she hoped would read correctly as, "I am here to listen, not to document." "No," Sarah said. The Queen looked at the notepad. Then back at Sarah. "Good," she said. "What I am going to tell you is not for your government first. It is for you first. Whether you choose to carry it to your government and how is the first decision I need you to make." Outside, 2 light years away, Admiral Yush was sitting in the relay station watching a communication feed that had gone silent 41 minutes ago, and thinking very carefully about patience. Sarah had negotiated contracts worth billions. She had mediated disputes between parties who genuinely despised each other and still needed each other enough to keep talking. She had once spent 11 days in a pressurized habitat on Callisto, locked in a room with 2 mining executives and a water rights attorney, eating packaged meals and refusing to leave until they found language everyone could sign. She knew how to read a room, how to read a silence, how to read the difference between a pause that was tactical and a pause that was genuine. The Queen's silence, as she gathered her thoughts after that opening statement, was genuine. "Your species," Zelera 4 began, "is producing something we did not expect it to produce at this stage of development." She spoke galactic standard precisely, the way someone speaks a language they have learned as a discipline rather than absorbed as a child. Each word placed deliberately. We have monitored 14 spacefaring civilizations across our recorded history. We have observed their development in the first century of interstellar contact. We have pattern models. Predictive frameworks built over 3,000 years of data. She paused. You are not following the pattern. Sarah kept her expression level. She had trained for this, or rather she had trained for everything she could anticipate, which meant that when the unexpected arrived, the training held even if the specific content didn't. She did not ask in what way. She waited. The Queen continued. Most civilizations at the stage your species occupies pursue one of two trajectories. The first, rapid expansion, resource acquisition, early conflict with neighbors, either absorption or decline within 300 to 400 years. The second, internal consolidation, slow outward development, eventual contact with a mature civilization, ourselves or another, and integration as a client state or trading partner. She laced her long fingers together on the table. Both trajectories are well understood. Both are manageable. Both are, in a sense, safe. And humanity is following neither. Humanity, the Queen said, is following something we do not have a name for yet, which is, in 3,000 years of pattern recognition, unusual enough to require direct evaluation. She laid out what the Valkyrie had observed over 42 years of covert monitoring, and she used the word covert without any apparent discomfort, as if secrecy in intelligence gathering was so self-evident that apologizing for it would be peculiar. The compact already knew the Valkyrie watched. They had assumed it. What they had not known was the depth of the observation or the conclusions that had been drawn from it. The Valkyrie had sensors in the outer system. Not weapons, sensors. Long-range, passive, enormously sophisticated instruments that had been recording human electromagnetic output, shipping lanes, military movements, political transmissions, and civilian broadcasts for 4 decades. They had not translated most of the civilian content. They had not needed to. Pattern recognition worked at a level of abstraction above content. What a civilization broadcasts matters less than how much, in what direction, with what frequency distribution, at what moments of crisis versus stability. Your species, the Queen said, is the first we have observed that demonstrates stable internal contradiction at civilizational scale without terminal faction fracture. She saw Sarah's expression and clarified, you fight among yourselves. Significantly. You have ideological divisions that in other species have preceded collapse. You have resource competition that in other cases has driven pre-contact civilizations to self-destruction. And yet, she stopped. You also cooperate. Not only when threatened. Not only under external pressure. You cooperate speculatively. You build institutions that have no immediate survival value. You invest in knowledge that will not be useful for generations. You argue about ethics, extensively, it appears, in situations where the ethical cost of not arguing would be lower. Sarah said nothing. This is unusual, the Queen said. It was the 3rd time she had used that word, and Sarah had begun to understand that in Valkyrie usage, unusual was not a casual descriptor. It was a classification. In our experience, the civilizations that argue about ethics are either weak, constrained by internal conflict from effective action, or they are old, post-scarcity, past the point where ethical argument carries material cost. Your species is neither weak nor old. You are still resource-constrained. You are still in active political conflict on multiple scales. And you are still having the argument. The implications of what the Queen was describing took shape slowly in Sarah's mind, the way large structures become visible from a distance. The Valkyrie, across 3,000 years of observation, had built a model of how civilizations develop. That model had held for 14 species. It was breaking on humanity. Not because humanity was more powerful than the model accounted for, they demonstrably were not, by any military or technological metric, but because humanity was making choices the model classified as irrational for their developmental stage, and those choices were not producing the failures that the model predicted irrationality would produce. They were watching, Sarah understood, not with the interest of a predator observing prey. With the interest of scientists observing an experiment that was producing unexpected results. Why tell me this? Sarah asked. Why now? Why not your own analysts, your own diplomatic channels? The Queen was quiet for a moment. Because the decision I am facing is not a diplomatic one. It is a strategic one. And the council I rely on for strategic guidance has already offered its recommendation. Which is? Quarantine. The word sat between them. The pattern you represent is, by our models, unstable. Not dangerous in the sense of aggressive expansion. Unstable in the sense of unpredictability. The council's position is that what cannot be modeled cannot be safely managed, and what cannot be safely managed should be contained until it resolves into a recognizable state. Sarah's hand was resting on her notepad. She did not reach for her pen. "And your position?" she asked. The Queen looked at her for a long time before answering. Outside, the flagship hung in deep space, vast and quiet and dark. Inside, two individuals representing civilizations separated by 3,000 years of development sat across a low table, and the moment between question and answer stretched out long enough that Sarah could hear her own heartbeat. "My position," Zelerafor said, "is that my counsel may be wrong. Which is also unusual." What the Queen said next Sarah would remember for the rest of her life. Not because it was the most surprising thing she had heard in 48 hours of surprises, but because it was the most honest. "I have ruled the Valkyrie hegemony for 61 years. I have made decisions that determine the fate of 43 systems and every living thing within them. I have been wrong before. I have been wrong in small ways and in large ones, and I have learned that the cost of being wrong about something you dismissed is always higher than the cost of being wrong about something you examined. My council wants to dismiss your species. I am not convinced we should." She met Sarah's eyes. "So I brought you here to examine it? To examine you. Because you cannot understand a civilization from its broadcast signal and its shipping lanes. You can understand its pattern. To understand its character, you need to talk to it." Sarah thought about Admiral Yush, standing in a relay station 2 light-years away, watching a silent communication feed. She thought about Dr. Wen, who had spent 20 years translating the margins of a civilization he was never supposed to see this clearly. She thought about 42 years of cold silence and the 11 sentences that had broken it. "Then ask me whatever you need to ask," Sarah said. The Queen picked up her writing instrument. "I intend to," she said. "We have time." The conversation lasted 12 hours. Sarah had expected diplomacy, the structured, protocol-heavy exchange of positions that characterized every formal contact she had participated in over 15 years. What she got was something closer to an extended philosophical examination, conducted by someone who was simultaneously brilliant, patient, and thoroughly uninterested in comfortable answers. The Queen asked about war first. Not humanity's military capability, she already had that data, in more detail than compact defense intelligence would have been comfortable knowing, but about the experience of it. What humans felt during conflict. How they processed casualties. Whether they mourned enemies. Sarah answered carefully and honestly. "It depends on the person and the war. Some do. Some don't. We have literature about it, a great deal of it, which suggests the question has bothered us for as long as we've been fighting." "Literature," the Queen said. It came out as a category rather than a response. "We have noted the volume of human creative output. It is disproportionate to your developmental stage." "We've been told that," Sarah said. "We've never been sure whether that's a compliment. It is an observation." The Queen paused. "What do you use it for?" Sarah sat with that for a moment. "What do you use it for?" The question wasn't dismissive. It was direct in the way that Valkyrie communication had appeared, across every contact, to be fundamentally direct. They were not a civilization that had developed small talk, or at least not in the forms humanity would recognize. "We use it to figure out what we think," Sarah said finally. "About things we haven't resolved yet. We write about death so we can understand what we think about it. We write about war so we can argue about whether it was worth it. We write about alien civilizations we've never met." She paused. "We've been doing that for longer than we've actually met any." The Queen made a notation on one of her paper documents. Sarah did not try to read it. "Your species argues publicly," the Queen said. "About governance. About resource allocation. About ethics. This is visible in your broadcast data. Other species at your stage argue also, but the argument is typically resolved. One faction wins, the other is suppressed or absorbed. Your arguments appear to be structural. They do not resolve." "Some of them don't," Sarah agreed. "We've been arguing about certain questions for thousands of years. We keep refining the terms. We don't always find answers." "This does not cause instability?" "It causes a lot of instability," Sarah said. "We have political crises regularly. We have governments that fall, systems that fail, institutions that turn out to have been wrong about important things. We rebuild them. Sometimes better. Sometimes just differently. And you find this acceptable." "We find it preferable to the alternative," Sarah said. "The alternative being, someone decides they have the answer and stops the argument." The Queen was quiet for a long time. "In the Valkyrie system, the sovereign matriarch decides. The council advises. The decision is final. I know, Sarah said. That's a different design. It has advantages ours doesn't. Faster decisions. More coherent long-term strategy. Less internal friction. She met the Queen's eyes. It also puts a great deal of weight on the sovereign matriarch being right. The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. Sarah filed it, she heard that. She's thinking about it. They broke for what the Valkyrie escort indicated was a meal period. Approximately 2 hours in which Sarah was returned to a small chamber off the main corridor, given water and something that had been clearly researched and prepared as human-compatible nutrition, though it tasted primarily of function rather than flavor. She used the time to write 9 pages of notes in her physical notepad, in a shorthand only she could read. Not for the debrief. For herself. She had learned, in 15 years of high-stakes diplomacy, that memory under stress is unreliable, and that the act of writing forces clarity that memory doesn't. What she wrote wasn't just content. It was pattern analysis. The Queen's questions had a structure. They moved from military to cultural to political to economic and back again, in a sequence that wasn't random. She was building a profile, not gathering data points. Each question was positioned to create context for the next. She was mapping not just what Sarah knew but how Sarah thought. Sarah wrote at the bottom of the 9th page, "She's good at this. Better than anyone I've worked with. And she's been at it for 61 years. Then she ate what remained of the meal, closed the notepad and waited. The afternoon session, she was tracking time by her internal watch, the only timekeeping instrument she'd brought, moved into territory she hadn't anticipated, specific events. The Queen had done her homework at a level that was, on reflection, almost unsettling. She asked about the Martian Compact crisis of 2187, when a constitutional dispute had nearly fractured the human interplanetary government in its second decade. She asked about the deep space mining wars, not the version in the history books but the version in the classified conflict archives, which she should not have been able to access. "You know things about us that we haven't released," Sarah said. "Yes," the Queen agreed with perfect calm. "That's a policy violation under Interstellar Contact Convention." The convention, the Queen said, was written by civilizations that wanted predictable contact relationships. It was not written by civilizations that needed to make accurate assessments before deciding whether to quarantine a species. She looked at Sarah steadily. "You would have done the same." Sarah thought about compact defense intelligence. About the sensors they had pointed at every star system within 40 light-years. About the communication intercepts that Dr. Wen's team had spent 20 years analyzing. "Yes," she said. "We would have. Then we understand each other on that point." The Queen returned to her notes. The Martian crisis. It was resolved without military intervention, despite the faction that was advocating for it. There were people who wanted to use force, Sarah confirmed. There were people who argued that the dispute needed a definitive resolution and that a negotiated compromise would just defer the problem. They were outvoted. By whom? By the people who thought the cost of being right at gunpoint was too high. Sarah paused. Even if you win a civil conflict, you win a fractured government. We'd seen what that produces. We chose the slower resolution. And the problem was deferred? The problem was managed. It comes up again in different forms every 20 years or so. Sarah allowed herself a small, tired smile. We have standing committees for it now. The Queen made another notation. Standing committees, she repeated, as if the concept were a new data point in a long calculation. It sounds anticlimactic, Sarah said. It mostly is. That's usually what stable looks like from the inside. For the first time in 12 hours, Sarah thought she saw something shift in the Queen's expression. Not quite a smile. She wasn't certain Valkyrie facial musculature produced smiles in any human recognizable form, but something in the stillness around the eyes that changed quality. That, Zelera 4 said, is the most interesting thing you have said today. She ended the session shortly after with a statement that Sarah would turn over in her mind for weeks afterward. My council believes your species is a problem to be solved. I am beginning to think it may be a problem to be studied. She set down her writing instrument and looked at Sarah with the complete, focused attention that had characterized every moment of the past 12 hours. The difference matters enormously. Problems to be solved are eliminated or contained. Problems to be studied are preserved. Sometimes even funded. Sarah looked at the Queen across the low table. Which direction are you leaning? She asked. That, the Queen said, will depend on what you decide to tell me tomorrow. On the second day, Sarah was given a different room. It was not explained. The escort simply led her down a different corridor after the meal break and opened a door to a chamber that was larger than the one she had slept in, with a viewport looking out onto the star field on one side and a wall of what appeared to be documentation on the other. Physical records, dense and ordered, the Valkyrie equivalent of an archive. She was left there for approximately 40 minutes before anyone came. It wasn't the Queen. The figure who entered was male. Sarah had spent enough time with Valkyrie biometric data to read the secondary markers with reasonable confidence, and his collar structure was different from the escort officers she had seen previously. Higher. More complex. Whatever rank that indicated was above the crew configuration she had been working from, but below what she had assessed the Queen's personal bearing to project. He spoke in Valkyrie. Not Galactic Standard. Sarah said in Galactic Standard, "I don't speak your language." "I'm sorry." He looked at her with an expression she could not read. Then he switched, not to Galactic Standard but to something else. A trade pigeon used in the neutral contact zones between Valkyrie Space and the Dresch Collective, which she recognized because Dr. Wen had included a primer in her pre-mission briefing materials on the off chance it would be useful. She had not expected it to be useful this quickly. "The Sovereign Matriarch does not have full Council consensus for this engagement," he said. Sarah processed this. Council member or Council adjacent? Someone with authority to speak on the Council's behalf, or at minimum to speak in its interests. Brought to her room while the Queen was presumably in other meetings. Speaking in a language that he had reason to believe she might understand but that the Queen's personal staff, if monitoring this conversation, might not. This was not official. This was a parallel channel. "I understand," she said in the same trade pigeon, measuring her words carefully. "What is the Council's concern?" "The Council's concern," the figure said, "is that the Sovereign Matriarch has made a decision about a contact situation based on a single interview with a single member of a species of 7 billion. One representative. One conversation. This is not procedure." "I agree it's unconventional," Sarah said. "It is more than unconventional." He moved to the viewport and looked out at the star field, the gesture having a quality that in a human she would have read as an attempt to appear casual. She wasn't sure if that translated. "The Council has the authority to request a formal review of any major strategic decision, including the decision to end, modify, or continue a quarantine recommendation. That review requires a majority. The Council currently holds majority." The implication was clear. The Queen had called Sarah here, had spent 12 hours questioning her, was building toward a decision, and the Council had the institutional authority to override it. "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah asked. "Because," he said, still looking at the stars, "the outcome of the Sovereign Matriarch's decision affects your species. You have a stake in understanding the constraints. And you have a stake in my understanding that the Queen's decision may not be final." Pause. "Yes." Sarah spent 10 minutes after he left sitting very still and thinking about what had just happened. The structure of it. The motivations behind it. This was internal Valkyrie politics. A 3,000-year-old hegemonic power structure showing her, deliberately or not, the seam between sovereign authority and council power. And someone on the council had decided that the best move was to let the human diplomat see that seam. The question was whether that was a warning, a negotiation, or a test. She reached for her notepad. 3 possibilities she wrote. 1. Council legitimately alarmed by Q's process. Member acting on principle. 2. Council using me to pressure Q. If I respond predictably, anxiety, urgency, try to manipulate Q's timeline, that confirms their model that humanity is reactive and short-sighted. 3. Q sent him. Testing whether I handle backchannel pressure without panicking or changing my approach. She looked at all 3. Act the same regardless, she wrote. Same person in the room with Q is out of it. When the Queen arrived 2 hours later, there was nothing in her bearing that suggested she knew about the visit. Or if she knew and was not showing it, that performance was consistent enough to be functionally identical. "Yesterday," the Queen said, settling into her chair, "you described stability as anticlimactic. I have been thinking about this." "I've been thinking about it too," Sarah said. "My council considers your species unstable. Their data is not wrong. Your internal conflicts are extensive. Your governmental structures change significantly across generations. Your resource conflicts, while not militarized at interstellar scale, are ongoing." She looked at Sarah. "By our standard metrics, you are unstable." "By your standard metrics," Sarah agreed. "You dispute the metrics. I dispute the conclusion. Your metrics were built on 14 civilizations that all developed within the same general framework. None of them were us. It's possible the framework fits most civilizations and happens not to fit ours. That doesn't mean we're a failed case. It might mean the framework has a blind spot. The Queen was still. You are suggesting our predictive models are flawed. I'm suggesting they're incomplete. There's a difference. Sarah paused. You're the one who brought me here because your models produced an unexpected output. I'm the unexpected output. I think you already agree the models have a gap. Zelera 4 was quiet for a long moment. Then, the Council wants a quarantine recommendation confirmed within the next 3 days. They have the institutional authority to request that timeline. She said it without effect, the way someone states a constraint in a negotiation. Sarah noted that the Queen had raised the Council, had in effect confirmed that the visit this morning was something she was aware of, and had chosen to address directly. I know, Sarah said simply. The Queen's eyes held on her for a moment longer than usual. How? Because someone from the Council told me. No reaction. Then, what did you do with that information? I wrote down my analysis of why he came and what it meant. Then I decided to behave the same way I would have if he hadn't. Another long pause. Then, almost imperceptibly, that shift in the stillness around the Queen's eyes again. My Council's primary argument, Zelera 4 said, is that a civilization that cannot be predicted is a civilization that cannot be trusted. They argue that your species' deviation from standard developmental models is evidence of chaotic tendency rather than adaptive intelligence. What's your argument? Sarah asked. My argument, the Queen said, is that the Council confuses predictability with trustworthiness. They are not the same thing. She looked down at her documents, then back up. A species that does exactly what your models say it will do is easy to manage. It is not necessarily safe. A species that surprises you, consistently, creatively, without self-destruction, may be far more valuable than a predictable one, and require a different framework to understand. Sarah thought about 42 years of cold contact. About the relay stations and the sensor nets and the careful, patient watching. About a civilization that had observed 14 species and absorbed or quarantined them all. You've never had a peer, she said. The Queen looked at her. Every civilization you've encountered has either been weaker than you or aligned with you by choice or necessity. You've never had contact with something that didn't fit neatly into a managed relationship. That's not a criticism, it's an observation. Sarah kept her voice level. Your models assume hierarchy. One party manages, one party is managed. What you're trying to figure out is whether we're the kind of thing that can be managed at all. The Queen's expression was unreadable as it often was. But she didn't deny it. And if you're not, she asked. Then you have to decide, Sarah said, whether the alternative to management is destruction or something your models haven't named yet. The Council's deadline was 3 days. The Queen looked at the documents on her table, and for the first time, she looked like someone who was not entirely certain she was using the right framework to read them. On the morning of the 3rd day, Sarah was not brought to the Queen's chamber. She was brought to the Council chamber. It was the largest interior space she had seen on the ship. A long room with a high vaulted ceiling and a table that seated 31 Valkyrie, arranged in the elliptical configuration that compact cultural analysis had long theorized was their preferred collective decision-making layout. The Queen sat at the table's head, distinguished not by an elevated position but by a stillness that the rest of the room oriented around. 28 Council members were present. 2 seats were empty. The 13th seat from the head, the one that should have held a 30th Council member, was occupied by the figure who had visited Sarah the previous morning. He looked at her when she entered. She gave him nothing. The session that followed was 3 hours long and entirely in Valkyrie. Sarah could not follow the words and no one translated in real time. What she could follow was the structure of the argument, the rhythm of exchange, the patterns of who deferred to whom, who held the floor longest, which statements produced stillness and which produced response. She was not meant to follow the content, she concluded. She was meant to be present for it. To sit in the room as a fact. As evidence, on one side or the other, of whatever was being argued. She sat upright and kept her face neutral and her hands still on the table in front of her. The Valkyrie posture of non-aggression she had memorized from the biometric files. And she watched 30 of the most powerful beings in a 43-system hegemony debate what to do about a species that had recently sent one diplomat and a notepad to make their case. The Council vote, when it came, was announced by a senior official she hadn't seen before. The Queen's translator, a younger Valkyrie seated behind the Queen's position, rendered it in Galactic Standard, quietly, in Sarah's ear. 17-11. The Council voted to uphold the quarantine recommendation. Sarah let no expression show on her face. She had spent 15 years learning how to receive bad news in rooms where showing that you'd received it was itself a negotiating position. The Queen did not move for a long moment after the vote was announced. Then she spoke, to the Council in Valkyrie 2 sentences. The translator provided them. The Council's recommendation is noted. I will issue my decision by end of session. Not I accept the recommendation. Not I reject it. Her decision. Separate from the Council's recommendation. The Council member who had visited Sarah's room spoke up, a formal objection by the tone and the response it generated. The Queen responded in a single sentence. The translator hesitated, then rendered it. The sovereign matriarch thanks the Council for its service and reminds them that recommendation and decision are not synonymous. There were 4 hours between the end of the Council session and the beginning of what the Queen's escort communicated to Sarah as a final meeting. Sarah spent them in the archive room from the previous day writing. Not analysis this time. Something closer to memory, the kind of writing you do when you're not sure what you'll have access to on the other side of the next few hours. She wrote about what the Queen had said across 3 days about predictability and trustworthiness. She wrote about the Council member in the early morning, and what his visit had told her about how power worked in a 3,000-year-old institution. She wrote about the ship, the silent geometry of it, the lighting that shifted with intention, the corridors that got wider as they approached authority. Then she wrote one paragraph that she came back to 3 times, revising it each time trying to get it right. The issue is not whether humanity is good enough for the Valkyrie standards. The issue is whether the Valkyrie are willing to have their standards expanded. They've spent 3,000 years building a framework that explains everything. We're the first thing it doesn't explain. That's terrifying if you believe the framework is complete. It's interesting if you believe frameworks are tools, not laws. She closed the notepad. The escort arrived. The Queen's chamber looked the same as it had at the start. The same table. The same documents. The same quality of concentrated presence in the room's central figure. Sarah sat in the same chair. She noticed, without commenting, that the Queen had removed most of the documents that had been on the table at their first meeting. The surface between them was nearly clear. The Council voted 17-11 to uphold the quarantine recommendation, the Queen said. I know, Sarah said. I was in the room. The quarantine recommendation is advisory, the Queen said. Sovereign decision authority rests with the matriarch. This is constitutional, not personal. She met Sarah's eyes. I am going to override the Council's recommendation. I want to tell you directly, and I want to tell you why before this becomes a formal announcement. Sarah waited. 3 days ago I brought you here to evaluate your species by evaluating one member of it. My Council considers this method inadequate. They are not wrong that it is incomplete. 7 billion people cannot be represented by one conversation. But adequacy and completeness are different standards. I brought you here because the question I needed answered could not be answered by broadcast data or shipping lane analysis. I needed to know something specific. What? Whether you knew what you were. The Queen held the stillness that was her habitual mode, but there was something in her voice that had shifted, not softer but more direct, the way a person speaks when they've finished considering and started deciding. Most civilizations at your developmental stage cannot describe themselves accurately from the outside. They believe their model of themselves. They present that model. They are unable to distinguish between what they are and what they wish to be, because the gap between the two is uncomfortable. You described your species' failures clearly. Your internal contradictions. Your structural instabilities. You did not minimize them. But you also did not apologize for them. You explained them as functional components of something that is still working. Sarah thought about the 11 sessions, the 12 hours of questions, the parliament debates and the mining wars and the standing committees. We've had a long time to get used to ourselves, she said. Yes, the Queen said. That is, I believe, part of it. She looked down at the clear table between them. My decision is to decline the quarantine recommendation and propose instead a formal contact framework. Not a client relationship. Not an integration pathway. A contact framework, regular diplomatic exchange, limited economic interaction at mutually agreed parameters, and a joint commission with a mandate to develop new predictive models for civilizations that do not fit existing patterns. Sarah heard the last sentence and understood its full weight. A joint commission to develop new models. Meaning, the Valkyrie were not just declining to quarantine humanity. They were proposing to use humanity to expand their understanding of what civilizations could be. The Council will object, Sarah said. The Council will adapt, the Queen replied, with the precise certainty of someone who has made difficult decisions for 61 years and knows the difference between opposition and terminal resistance. They're good at their work. They will build the framework properly once they accept the direction. And if they don't accept the direction? The Queen allowed a pause that was so precisely calibrated that Sarah was certain it was intentional. Then the sovereign matriarch's decision-making authority exists precisely for situations where consensus cannot be built in available time. She looked at Sarah with an expression that was as close to wry as anything Sarah had seen from her. I have used it before. I will have it explained to you. Sarah looked at the clear table between them. At the woman across it, the 3,000-year weight of her civilization behind her, the immediate opposition of her council in front of her, and the decision sitting in the space she had chosen to hold open. I need to ask you something, Sarah said. Before this becomes official. Ask. You spent 3 days questioning me, evaluating me, drawing conclusions about 7 billion people from one conversation. Your counsel is right that it's incomplete. She kept her voice level. What convinced you? The Queen was quiet for a long moment. The notepad, she said. Sarah blinked. Pardon? You brought a physical notepad and a pen. No recording devices. You wrote in a shorthand I could not read. You were in a situation of enormous consequence, surrounded by beings who could read every electromagnetic emission your body produced, and your response was to write things down in a format that only you could access. She looked at Sarah steadily. You were not trying to document the meeting for your government. You were thinking. Privately. Working things out for yourself in a way that kept them yours. Pause. That is the behavior of a species that believes in the value of internal process. That considers the quality of thought worth protecting even when the outcome is uncertain. Sarah looked at the notepad on the table in front of her. It is a small thing, the Queen said. But in my experience, it is the small choices, made under pressure, that tell you what a civilization actually values. The formal announcement was not made from the flagship. It was made from the Valkyrie hegemony's administrative center, the second largest station in their territory, orbiting a dwarf star 12 light-years from the flagship's position, and it was transmitted simultaneously in Galactic Standard, Valkyrie Formal Register, and 17 other languages used by species within the hegemony's sphere of influence. It was the first external policy statement the Valkyrie had issued in 11 years. The last one had been a boundary adjustment in the outer cluster. This was of a different order entirely. Compact intelligence intercepted the transmission at Relay Station 14 before it reached Earth directly, which gave Admiral Yush approximately 6 minutes of warning before the parliamentary notification system lit up across every government channel in the United Human Compact. He used those 6 minutes to sit in his office, read the transmission twice, and then draft a single-sentence secure message to the Secretary General's office. The contact framework is real. Do not make it political before we understand it. He sent the message and then sat back and thought about Sarah Mullen, who was at this moment somewhere in a shuttle between the Valkyrie flagship and the relay station, and who had apparently spent 3 days talking to the most powerful sovereign in the known cluster and come home with something that would take decades to fully understand. He had run worse odds than this. The reaction from the other civilizations in the hegemony sphere took longer to develop, but when it came, it was more significant than anyone in the Compact's policy division had modeled for. There were 11 civilizations in the hegemony's broader contact zone, not client states, not quarantined, but operating in the complex gray space of civilizations that the Valkyrie had chosen to observe and manage at arm's length. 4 of them had been in that relationship for over 200 years. They had learned, across those 2 centuries, that the Valkyrie did not make exceptions. That the hegemony's framework was fixed. That you developed within the parameters they set or you didn't develop at all. The contact framework announcement told them something they had not previously been given reason to believe, that the framework could change. That a civilization could arrive at the boundary of the hegemony's model and, rather than being absorbed or contained, could become the reason the model itself was revised. Within 18 months of the announcement, 3 of the 11 contact zone civilizations had formally requested inclusion in the Joint Commission. The Valkyrie Council, which had spent the first 6 months attempting to limit the Commission's mandate and operational scope, found itself facing a secondary consequence it had not anticipated. Civilizations that had been quietly accepting of hegemony management for generations were now asking for the first time to participate in how the rules were made. The council member who had visited Sarah's room during the flagship meeting wrote a formal dissent paper that circulated widely within Valkyrie administrative channels. Sarah's intelligence team eventually obtained a translated summary. His core argument was that the sovereign matriarch's decision had introduced systemic unpredictability into a framework that had functioned stably for 3,000 years. He was not wrong. He was also, Sarah concluded when she read it, arguing against a process that had already become irreversible. The Joint Commission convened for the first time 14 months after the flagship meeting, aboard a neutral station in the boundary zone between compact space and the hegemony's outer edge. Sarah was appointed the compact's permanent representative. She accepted the position on one condition, that Dr. Marcus would serve as her primary analytical advisor. One had spent the 6 months between the announcement and the Commission's first session writing a paper, dense, 78 pages, published in the Journal of Xenocultural Studies and subsequently cited in 14 parliamentary policy debates, titled Standard Models and Developmental Variants. Why one alien civilization's predictive framework failed on contact with humanity and what that tells us about predictive frameworks in general. It was not a triumphalist paper. It was a careful, technically rigorous argument that the Valkyrie's models had failed not because they were poorly constructed, but because they were built from a sample set that, by extraordinary historical circumstance, had excluded a particular type of civilizational development. He described humanity as a high internal friction stable system, a civilization that maintained coherence not by suppressing internal conflict but by converting it, over time, into institutional structure. Not efficiently, often painfully, but durably. He also included a section that the parliamentary debate largely ignored but that Sarah had read 3 times, a section on what humanity's developmental model cost. The instability was not trivial. The internal conflicts had consumed resources, delayed progress, and in several historical periods had come very close to ending the experiment entirely. The model worked, when argued, but it required a society willing to absorb the cost of its own disagreements rather than resolving them by force, and that willingness was not guaranteed in advance. It had to be rebuilt in every generation. Sarah had read that section 3 times because she recognized it. She had said something like it to the Queen on the second day in less academic language. Stable mostly looks anticlimactic from the inside. 3 years after the flagship meeting, the Joint Commission produced its first formal output, a revised contact framework document, co-authored by Valkyrie and compact analysts, that proposed supplementary metrics for evaluating civilizations at the boundary of existing predictive models. It was not a replacement of the Valkyrie's 3,000-year framework. It was, as the Commission's introduction described it, an expansion of the conditions under which the framework recognized the limits of its own applicability. The Valkyrie Council ratified it 17-11, the same margin as the original quarantine vote. Sarah noticed this and said nothing about it in her public remarks. In private she wrote it down. The sovereign matriarch Zelera IV and Sarah Mollin met formally once more 2 years after the flagship, at the Commission's inaugural session. The meeting was shorter than their first, 40 minutes, protocol structured, observed by delegation members from both sides. They exchanged the required formal statements. They reviewed the Commission's mandate. They signed the contact framework document on behalf of their respective governments. At the end of the session, after the delegations had begun to disperse and the observation protocols had technically concluded, the Queen said something that wasn't in the formal record. The Council, she said quietly, has requested that I articulate for the formal record the strategic rationale for my decision. They want a precedent framework. Rules by which a future sovereign matriarch could evaluate a similar situation and reach a defensible conclusion. Sarah recognized the situation immediately. An institution attempting to retroactively systematize an act of sovereign judgment. To turn a decision into a doctrine so that the decision would never have to be made that way again. What did you tell them? I told them, the Queen said, that I would consider it. Sarah waited. I will not be producing that document, the Queen said, because the decision I made is not the kind that produces a rulebook. The Council wants a rulebook because they believe that what happened here can be prevented from happening again if the parameters are defined correctly. They believe that the next civilization that does not fit the model should be handled more systematically. She looked at Sarah. They are thinking about it as a problem to be solved. And you're still thinking about it as a problem to be studied. I am thinking about it, the Queen said, as a relationship to be understood, which is a category my council does not yet have a formal framework for. She paused. I suspect your species has had one for some time. Sarah thought about 15 years of diplomacy. About mining disputes on Callisto and 11 days of packaged meals. About Admiral Yush in a relay station watching a silent feed. About a notepad and a pen, and the choice to leave the recording equipment behind. We have a word for it, she said. Diplomacy. Which sounds more formal than it is. Mostly it's just deciding to stay in the room. Even when it's uncomfortable. Even when you don't know if it's working. The Queen considered this. We have a word for it too, she said. The rough translation is endurance with intention. She looked at Sarah. It is not a common word in hegemony political discourse. It should be, Sarah said. The Queen made a sound that Sarah could not classify, not quite a laugh but something in the register of appreciation. Perhaps that too will be in the Commission's next report. Admiral Yush retired the year after the Contact Framework was ratified. At his farewell address to Compact Defense Intelligence, he said something that was quoted widely afterward and that had not, he insisted when asked, been written down before he gave the speech. We spent 42 years wondering if the Valkyrie would ever look at us. Turns out they never stopped. The question we should have been asking, the question we were not thinking clearly enough to ask, was what they would see when they did. We got lucky that what they saw was worth talking to. But luck is not a strategy. The reason it wasn't just luck is that for 42 years, while we were wondering if they were watching, a lot of people spent those years trying to make something worth watching. Scientists, diplomats, philosophers, people arguing in Parliament about questions that didn't have answers yet, people writing things down, people staying in the room. He paused. We should give them more credit than we do. And we should keep doing what they were doing. The Joint Commission's third annual report, published 5 years after the flagship meeting, included a supplementary appendix, not required by the Commission's mandate, added at the request of both Zelera IV and Sarah Mullen, titled, On the Value of Developmental Variance in Interstellar Contact Frameworks. Its conclusion ran to 4 sentences. The civilizations most valuable to long-term interstellar stability are not necessarily the most predictable, the most powerful, or the most culturally coherent. They are the ones that have found durable methods for converting internal conflict into institutional structure. This capacity is neither guaranteed nor permanent. It requires active maintenance by the civilizations in question, and active respect by those who observe them. One had written the first draft. Sarah had revised it twice. The Queen's senior analyst had revised it once more and returned it with a single notation in Valkyrie script that one, when he translated it, found he had no precise English equivalent for. The closest translation he could produce was, "This is what we were missing." He included that translation in the appendix. Without comment. It was, in his considered professional opinion, the most significant forward statement in 43 years of human Valkyrie contact. And it had taken 1 diplomat, 1 notepad, 1 pen, and 3 days aboard a ship called Silent Geometry to produce it.